Hello, my name is Alex Borucki, and I'm the director of the UCI Latin American Studies Center. This clip is part of our series Cortos Latinoamericanos, Latin American clips. Here we are today with Shauna Gillooly, who is a PhD candidate in political science at UCI. She was a Fulbright-Hays doctoral dissertation research abroad fellow, which provided support for her fieldwork in the Pacific Coast of Colombia. She also has been contributor to the Washington Post and to The Conversation, among other press outlets. Welcome, Shauna. Happy to meet you.
Hi, Alex. Thank you so much for having me.
This is great. Finally, I have read things about you, and it's finally good to put a face and a name all together. First, could you tell us about your current work on Colombia?
Yeah, so obviously things have changed quite a bit with the outbreak of COVID. Previously to that, however, I was conducting my fieldwork throughout the Pacific Coast of Colombia, particularly in the departments, which are US equivalents of states in Cauca, Valle del Cauca, y Nariño, which are kind of take up the southwestern part of the country near the Ecuadorian border. And so there I'm working on a few different levels. Firstly, working towards the theory of the bureaucracy of peace building. So the ways in which the Colombian government has developed and added to these many different bureaucratic apparatuses that are responsible for different aspects of peace building and transitional justice following the 2016 peace accords between the leftist guerrilla group, the Revolutionary Armed Forces of Colombia, and the Colombian government. And so kind of how they're dealing with this process of implementation, in addition to other armed groups that are still very active throughout the country, and in particularly in that region, including other guerrilla groups, some nebulous right-wing paramilitary forces, as well as narco trafficking, which both the leftist guerrilla groups and the right-wing paramilitary groups both have ties to. So I, in particular, work with a few indigenous and Afro-Colombian communities who I have developed close ties with over a period of almost 4 years of conducting fieldwork here, going back and forth between California and Colombia before I moved here permanently last year. And what is it, how does implementation, or the implementation of this peace accord in particular, because there have been several in the history of Colombia, several peace accords that have been implemented to varying degrees, but none of them to completion. So how does this particular peace accord implement the strategies that these communities already had in place with these different groups that control different parts of the country? Many of these communities are located in areas where there is a lack of state presence. Historically, that lack continues. And so many of them are often, at the whims of these different armed actors. So how have these communities created strategies of resistance, strategies of survival, ranging from everything between using neutrality as a concept of survival, so saying no armed group gets to enter this zone, including state forces. We offer no aid to anybody, but also the inherent dangers that come along with those types of strategies, which include continued threats, massacres, forced coca planting, which is the main ingredient in what eventually is processed into the drug cocaine. And many times these communities are already displaced, having already experienced violence from other parts of the country and moved to these different areas. So these are people who have experienced oftentimes generations of conflict. So for example, maybe they're from the interior. For example, there's a community in Buenaventura, which is one of my field sites, which is a coastal city in the Pacific, called the Nayero, And most of these people moved from different parts of the River Nairo because they were forced to, due to massacres against their community by paramilitary as well as guerrilla forces in the 1990s and early 2000s in Colombia. Since they've settled in Buenaventura, where they continue to be threatened primarily at this particular moment in time by paramilitary groups, but in the past there was also a significant guerrilla presence in Buenaventura as well. So it's this multi-layered, multi-generational issue of violence and displacement. And so I look at the ways in which how oftentimes these processes of peace negotiations and peace accords that are constructed in good faith, but constructed from a perspective that often doesn't take into account these root issues of structural violence and the ways that these issues will continue to impact people who have historically been on the worst end of violence in Colombia. So, you know, in Bogotá, overall, you're quite safe from any sort of violence related to a political, ideological struggle, as well as narco-trafficking violence in general. But you move outside the larger cities like Bogotá, Medellin, and the people who have historically received the worst end of the stick continue to do so. So those, which in short terms, or short-ish terms, that is what my research, my dissertation project is based on.
Thank you, Shauna. That's great. And coming more to the recent developments, this clip is being recorded in early October of 2020, and a lot has happened in Colombia in the past 2 months. Can you tell us a little bit more how that connect to your work?
Yeah, absolutely. So obviously COVID is changing the way that we're doing field. For example, my last trip was in mid-March. I haven't really left then. Unfortunately, so fortunately, the Colombian government was relatively proactive in its behavior in attempting to stop the spread of COVID, or at least they made an effort to do so. We are here in Bogotá just emerging from a 7-month-long quarantine. For the first time in about 6 months, national flights or domestic flights within the country are happening again. Roads between municipalities and departments are reopening again. Although the land and terrestrial borders remain closed, Colombia is slowly starting to open up to international flights once again. However, several armed groups in different parts of the country used the opportunity of this relatively strict quarantine to consolidate their control of territory in different parts of the country, primarily more rural areas and primarily areas where one can grow coca, or areas where there are fortuitous trafficking routes out of the country to these lucrative markets, primarily in the United States, but also in Western Europe, in the Pacific, as well as the northeastern parts of the country. So that means that oftentimes people in different parts of the country through the past 6 months were subjected to absolutely brutal lockdowns imposed not by the national government, but by whatever paramilitary or guerrilla group had control of their territory. You know, I saw graffiti sent to me by contacts and collaborators from different parts of the countries that would basically have the tagline of the name of whatever group, whether that was the ELN or Clan de Golfo or whoever, saying, you know, stay inside or be killed. So people in these smaller areas are really subjected to absolutely brutal lockdown measures imposed by violence and backed by violence by these extra state groups. In addition to that, as things have slowly started to reopen up here, probably between the last 2 months or so, we've seen a resurgence of killings and massacres throughout the country at levels that haven't been seen in Colombia in 15 or 20 years. So these are massacres of, 12 people, 13 people, 14 people happening in different parts of the country, being assassinated by these extra armed forces. Groups that have taken the opportunity of quarantine, of the outbreak of COVID, to consolidate their territorial control. I also think to a certain extent the Colombian government, national government, wasn't paying as much attention perhaps as they should have been to these shifts in territorial power between these different armed actors, particularly at the beginning of quarantine. Kind of all of the attention was on preventing the outbreak of COVID, but nobody really foresaw this unintended consequence of the lockdown, which was more civilians are being exposed to significantly higher levels of violence in different parts of the country because of the ways in which armed groups have used this opportunity to consolidate their territorial control in different areas. And this is particularly concerning because, again, we haven't seen these levels of violence, this amount of massacres. For example, I think it was back in mid-September, there was something like 4 or 5 massacres in a week, and it was Colombia's most deadly week in 25 years. So seeing these levels of violence that really take a lot of people back to the worst years of the conflict, late 80s, early 90s, it's really scary, especially for these people who live in these more rural areas as well as these historically afflicted areas. So that's actually been a very concerning turn of events here, kind of as a result of COVID. Obviously, as far as my work goes, everything is quite up in the air as far as when I might be able to return to fieldwork. And at this point in particular, there might be some field sites that I will not be able to return to at all because of the way that the security situation in these places have changed. And the Pacific Coast of Colombia, which historically is one of the most abandoned parts of the country by the state, is once again kind of getting the brunt of this. So at this point, it's a bit unclear if I'll be able to get back to some of my field sites ever before I complete my dissertation. Another development, which was something that was happening previous to COVID, was Mexican cartels moving into parts of Colombia to establish their own bases, their own areas of support. And this is both interesting but very concerning, because this is the first time really in history that the Mexican cartels have managed to really secure a foothold in Colombia, and not for lack of trying. Historically, the Colombian narco traffickers have held such a secure foothold or enough of a monopoly of power that they just traded as equal partners with the Mexican cartels, but the Mexican cartels were never really able to get an actual geographical foothold. That has changed in certain areas of the country, particularly with these proliferations of smaller armed actors who also work as narco traffickers, but they're smaller, they're less organized, they don't have the level of control that we've historically seen from, people like the Cali cartel, the Medellin cartel, Clan de Golfo even has lost a lot of its power in the Caribbean coastal part of the country. So there's a lot of movement happening, a lot of unintended security consequences as a result of the COVID outbreak and the subsequent quarantine, which is only making things more difficult for people who are working on social and economic justice initiatives, land rights activists, environmental activists, many of whom are indigenous and Afro-Colombian. So these people are, similarly to the rest of the world, being disproportionately impacted by violence, threats against their persons for the work that they're doing, in part in attempts to hold the Colombian government accountable for the promises that it's made to them, not only in the 2016 peace accords, but also in previous laws dating back all the way to the early 1990s. For example, Ley 70, that was established in the 1991 Constitution, of which they still haven't seen the fruits of. So,
wow.
Yeah, there's a lot going on.
Yeah, no. Thank you very much. It's overwhelming, really. And you are there in Bogotá, something that I did not realize immediately when we began our conversation.
Yes.
Okay, well, that's all for today. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you again, Alex.
Bye.